Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another GINSA webinar. I'm GINSA's Director of Foreign Policy, Jonathan Rui. Today's webinar, entitled The U.S. Strikes Back, will cover the unfolding military standoff between America and Iran across the Middle East. On January 28th, 3 American service members that were based in Jordan were killed in a drone attack by an Iranian proxy based out of Iraq. It was the first fatal such attack since the outbreak of the current regional conflict in the wake of October 7th. But Iran-backed forces have launched more than 160 armed strikes on U.S. targets around the region during that same period. This latter number actually continues to rise even after U.S. response starting early this weekend, as Iran's proxies conducted several follow-on attacks over the weekend. Again, as I mentioned, since the United States started its response in Iraq and Syria last Friday. This is not the first round of U.S. retaliation against Iran-backed attacks in recent months, though the Biden administration certainly appears to be signaling that this round is somehow different. To discuss this pattern of escalation and conflict, including America's ongoing response, and to discuss where we go from here, I'm privileged to be joined, as always, by General Chuck Wald and by John Hanna. General Wald is a distinguished fellow with GINSA's Gemunder Center and a longtime friend of the organization. Previously, he was Deputy Commander of U.S. European Command, and prior to that, he was the former Commander of U.S. Central Command Air Forces. John Hanna is the Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow at GINSA's Gemunder Center. Before that, he served in a range of positions in the U.S. government, including as National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. As a reminder to our audience, please type any questions you may have into the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll address them as best we can throughout the course of the webinar. So, obviously a lot to get to. Before we delve into the details of the recent events and sort of trying to figure out where we go from here, I want to sort of level set with our audience, because I think we've heard the word deterrence thrown around a lot in recent days and even weeks and months, and talks of escalation, avoiding escalation, what all that means. So I think let's, to take a sort of a half step back and start with the more foundational question. I'd like to leverage the fact that both of our panelists have many years in experience in government and out of government, and dealing with the more basic question of how we deter Iran and what that means. So, General Wald, I'll start with you, but then turn the question over to John afterward. Based on your experience, what does it take to deter Iran? Do we know what that means? Have we done it well in the past? Because I think obviously currently we're not doing a good job. So are there instructional things we can take, or are there things we know about the Iranian regime that can form the basis for solid deterrence?
Thank you, Jonathan. It's good to see John and the audience as well. It's not a simple answer, but I will say this. Credibility is everything. Subtlety with the Iranians is not a real good way to go. And you have to be careful, because talking, big talk about retaliation is easy to do when you're not responsible. But the fact of the matter is, the Iranians are a show me, not tell me kind of organization. The leadership, the mullahs and the U.S. and the IRGC. And I'll just give a quick example where it didn't work very well. This has happened over and over, administration from administration. But back in the waning years of the last Trump administration, the Iranians shot down a Global Hawk UAV, one of the more expensive ones, big one, over the west coast of Iran in the Persian Gulf. And the United States prepared to respond to that. And up until the last minute, we were going to attack the Iranian military facilities at Bandar Abbas, as you may recall. And the strike was called off, I think, hours just before it was to occur, based on the fact that there was a collateral damage concern. Okay, I get that. The problem is our credibility gets shot when that happens, not just with the Iranians, but with our allies as well. So right now we're in a position, I think the Iranians know just how hard to push. They don't have any internal mechanisms for controlling what they do from a Congress. They don't have a Congress to watch, or their laws are made by themselves. So they can do whatever they want, and they can push internationally as fast or as far as they want. They don't worry about international law. And the only thing they really, really understand, I believe in my heart, is power. They have to understand that they're going to be punished for bad behavior, and not just punished at some surrogate level, maybe a militia in Iraq, Syria, or someplace like that. They're going to be punished. Their regime is going to be punished, the IRGC or them. So again, easy to say because I'm not in charge and not responsible, but I believe strongly that the Iranians will only stop what they're doing, or even supporting people for doing what they're doing, by virtue of the fact they know they're going to be punished. And I think we're going to have to hit something that's probably an Iranian sovereign territory along the coast.
So I want to eventually pivot into picking up on General Wald's last few points there. But John, anything before we move on that initial question about your impressions and experiences about, you know, how Iran acts, what makes them deterrable, and if we've done it well?
Well, just it's great to see Chuck Wald again. To have him on a webinar is terrific. Listen, I've always understood deterrence, that the enemy has got to believe, in order to be deterred, that whatever pain they attempt to inflict on you, they need to know that they're going to suffer pain times 2, times 3, times 4 to things that they hold dear. And everything about the signaling that this administration has been engaged in since 2021 is that, in response to all of these Iranian attacks, what Iran holds dear, the question of actually hitting Iranian personnel or Iranian assets, they have come to the conclusion, quite legitimately, that the Biden administration is not prepared to inflict overwhelming pain on Iran, more than it has the will to impose deterrent and escalation dominance on Iran. And that is an equation that is going to result in escalation. It's provocative. The maximum of if you want peace, prepare for war. Everything about the Biden administration's body language is they want peace, but they are not prepared to go to war with Iran. That is what they are signaling. And therefore, Iran, to some extent, can play this game of attacking Americans, American allies, American troops with relative impunity, to the last Iraqi militiaman, and there's endless Iraqi militiamen, to the last Syrian, to the last Houthi, to the last Hamas or PIJ fighter. They can do all of that without having any fear that an Iranian Revolutionary Guard commander or Iranian ship or an IRGC naval base or drone factory are going to suffer any consequences, anything that's meaningful to the supreme leader in Iran. And we've allowed that to happen over the last several years. As Chuck says, some of it goes back even further than that, to some of the actions of the Trump administration that eroded deterrence. But we've now got ourselves into a situation where the most powerful military on the face of the planet, our worst adversary in this part of the world, says we got plenty of capability. The Americans do not have the will to inflict any level of pain on Iran itself. And therefore, we've got it's free hunting against American troops, American interests, and American friends in this part of the world. And somehow now, once you've dug yourself into that hole, once deterrence has eroded to that extent, I'm afraid it's even more risky and more dangerous and more costly for you to do what's necessary to reestablish that deterrence. And it does make the potential for a major escalation, and our willingness to go forward with that escalation, if we're going to reestablish deterrence, I'm afraid at this point it's necessary. It will take a lot more today than it might have taken a couple of years ago to reestablish American deterrence with the Iranians and with the Iranian supreme leader.
So thank you, John. And as you sort of mentioned at the end of your comments there, deterrence isn't just about capability, because if it was purely a question of capability, I think America would have a pretty innate advantage. But as you mentioned, it's this issue of, and as General Wald mentioned, credibility and reputation. And the more that erodes, the harder it is to restore. So I want to start out. Let's just look at what's been happening so far based on what the administration has said they're going to do. We've seen a higher intensity and sort of broader spray of strikes since Friday than we've seen in the past few upticks in U.S. responses since October 7th. But I want to sort of give our audience some context. Those strikes may be more intensive. Quantitatively, they may be bigger and involve dropping more weight of heavy metal on Iranian-aligned targets. But based on what you've seen so far, I mean, I think we know the answer is these are insufficient to restore deterrence based on the parameters we've laid out. But General Wall, I'd like to start with you and then go to John again. What is it about the strikes that you've seen so far or have not seen that make you think, I don't want to phrase it as a leading question, but that these are insufficient to restore deterrence based on how we've laid out Iran's attitude and view toward America to begin with? So General Wall, I'll start with you. What have you seen based on the U.S. response since Friday, and even before that, the messaging that we've been sending to the Iranians about what we're going to do and not do?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to be critical of the administration, which I tend to be right now. I just think they're doing a poor job of not just articulating what we're trying to do, but actually strategically, acting against the enemy. And we continue to send just terrible signals from the standpoint of almost being apologetic that we're hitting Houthi targets or we're hitting other things, and we have things on the news. The news media is a little more even better at articulating what a good strategy would be than necessarily our administration. I think I hate to be that critical, but I think the fact that the Iranians come back and kind of chuckle at the fact that we're hitting some of the militias who they don't really care about, that they start warning us that we shouldn't hit a couple ships that are in the Red Sea, but now are in port a couple places, but have been sitting there for years. And we're saying that we have a kind of a stair-step approach of escalation here to make it harder and harder for the enemy to, tolerate what we're going to do. But the message I get is we'll know it's a good response when we hear the enemy say it is, rather than we know in advance. And it tells me that we're not sure what the heck we're really doing. Mm-hmm. And I really worry that we're so careful. There's been so many things that have happened. Right now, we have kind of an incapacitated Secretary of Defense. He's got to be very careful after what happened with the hospital situation. We've got the election going on, which I think a lot of people in the administration are concerned that this is going to, put it over the edge as far as winning the next election. So I think there's politics are always involved, but I think it's probably over concentrated right now on that. And I think we have a very risk averse administration, to tell you the truth. And I think the adversary, in this case, mainly the Iranians, are outplaying us strategically from the standpoint of both daily execution and strategic way ahead. And again, it's the old boxing saying, right? Everybody's really tough until they get hit in the face the first time. And the United States is going to have to say to ourselves, maybe we have people in administration that don't like the fact that you're attacking people or blowing things up. You just have to do that right now. And I think there's a serious reluctance on the administration's part to escalate. And I think they're not necessarily worried that we're going to, fail as a country from the standpoint of Iran attacking us. I think they're nervous that they're going to be looked upon as being less than sophisticated. And, we're not in a sophisticated process here. This is an adversary that doesn't give a crap about sophistication. They care about being powerful in that region, and they'll do whatever they have to do that. And we've just got to start acting the same way as they are, except we're tougher than they are. And we need to go back and smack them as hard as we possibly can. Obviously, we're not going to do a nuke or something like that, but we've got capabilities that can put them back. And the IRGC needs to know they're going to be held accountable. I just don't think we're ready to do that administratively.
So I thank you, General Walden. I do want to get to that more sort of forward-looking approach of, what do we actually do, what might be done and messaged differently. But John, I just wanted to give you a chance to follow on to General Wald's comments or observations about what we're doing now in terms of both in terms of the actual strikes we're conducting, but also the messaging we're seeing. It seemed like the administration went out of its way in advance of the strikes beginning on Friday to explicitly telegraph the where and the when of what the United States was going to do, and sort of setting our own predetermined red lines of we're not going to cross. We're not going to take out IRGC leadership. We're going to give a chance for the actual IRGC to evacuate from the intended targets. With all that hedging, is there anything that we're going to do kinetically at this point that's meaningful in any sense, or do we risk just sort of feeding into what you described earlier, which is actually the more we keep doing the same of what we've been doing before at this point, we're just further eroding that deterrence deficit that you talked about earlier?
Yeah, listen, this, as Chuck said, this was a much larger strike than previous strikes, but as you said, we messaged this thing almost 5 or 6 days in advance. We gave the enemy warning that this was coming, gave the enemy warning that we didn't want to escalate. When you've got your defense secretary, your chairman of the Joint Chiefs, all spending as much time focusing on their concerns about escalation and their desire not to escalate as they do about protecting our forces and avenging the death of American soldiers by holding Iran accountable, you've got a real serious problem, not to mention, obviously, the commander-in-chief talking and signaling in exactly the same way. So I think we dropped 125 precision-guided munitions. We sent over our bombers not to hit anything of consequence to the Iranian regime itself, expending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in response to a single drone that killed 3 Americans that probably was worth less than $500. That is not a sustainable equation. The Iranians laugh at it. We allegedly killed about 40 personnel. They mostly all seem to be guards of these facilities, since all the prominent commanders in large part had, hightailed it back to Baghdad or Tehran. It's just all of it together, both the messaging as well as the actual operation, when you begin to dissect it, all of it reeks of unseriousness, not befitting a superpower that just lost 3 troops in battle to a campaign that is obviously, at least since October 7th, all being orchestrated in every single one of these theaters by Iran, by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force. Whether it's the Houthis, it's the Iraqi militias, the militias in Syria, Hezbollah, all of them are being orchestrated by Iran. They all got turned on basically at the same time on October the 8th to try and inflict pain on America and Israel to agree to a ceasefire that would save Hamas. When we had the first pause at the end of November, they all went silent immediately in unison when they thought they might get a permanent ceasefire out of that and save Hamas's hide. But as soon as that ceasefire ended, they all began again in unison. Virtually all of these militias in Iraq and Syria are creations of the IRGC Quds Force. We got to get serious. Iran is the problem. The Iranian alliance, Iranian network that is not only trying to fight our best ally in Gaza, but they are fighting the American-led order in the entire Middle East. They are attacking it, trying to take us down, trying to drive us out of the region, destroy Israel, and exert Iranian hegemony and power over this region in league increasingly with our worst global adversaries in China and Russia and North Korea tacked onto that as well, all operating in one form or another to support each other against the United States-led global order. And we've just got to face up to that fact and develop a really multifaceted, comprehensive political, economic, information, operations, diplomatic strategy to really begin pushing back and inflicting pain on these guys.
Yeah, can I just, first of all, that was
Please.
really well stated. Can I just say one thing too, John? It's kind of a footnote, but one of the things about the recent activities that really bothers me as a former commander a lot is the fact that the Iranians, through their proxies, wherever, were even able to attack this Tower 22 outpost, and our defenses were basically asleep, thinking it was our own drone coming in. I mean, as a commander, as an operational commander, I go, you got to be kidding me. What kind of excuse is that? Are you asleep? You don't know where your drones, there are people that fly these drones. They aren't autonomous generally. And the fact that that's been underplayed, the fact that that was allowed to, we lost 3 of our American fellow soldiers. That's the most of it, and the not the least of which is our credibility, that we can't even defend an outpost against some, little drone of some sort. But it was basically people were asleep at the switch. And all that's been going on since, for the last 20 years, plus after October 7th in the region, you think we'd have commanders that would be pretty darn alert, even if you're an outpost commander. And if I'm the Iranians, I'm going, these guys are, they're almost inept. They allowed us to attack one of their outposts out there after all that's going on, where heightened tensions it's pretty obvious. We have got to get our act straight. And I'll tell you, the commanders out there need to be held accountable, because it's the credibility of our military that we're talking about. And if I'm the Iranian IRGC, I'm going, these guys are like, it's a bunch of clowns out there. And so it's not just the credibility of, like we're talking about it in a bigger sense here, but it's the day-to-day tactical credibility of our forces we've got to be paying attention to too. And we go after this thing, and John, I thought, was really articulate. But this, and you mentioned it too, this idea of relaying our intention before it happens, even though it maybe is a little bit vague, is ridiculous. The last time when we got Soleimani, that was a good deal. That was a big move. It was a lot of credibility. It put them back on their heels. But we've had less of those than we've had of the Tower 22 attacks. We got to watch it.
So, General Wald, I'm glad you brought up that issue of the tactical credibility. It seems like one of the issues that I've heard in recent months about sort of the U.S. posture across the Middle East militarily is perhaps a lack of adequate and reliable defenses, especially air defenses for our bases. Given all your experience with CENTAF, do you have a sense of I guess on the one hand how well defended some of these bases are? You mentioned it almost seems like we might be asleep at the wheel in some sense. How well defended our bases might be, and
yeah. No, I think
that's
it's a really good point, and I don't think it's been discussed enough. If you look back at the Saudi oil fields that were attacked at Abqaiq and Khurais a couple of years ago by obviously Iranian-backed attack, very sophisticated. And we kind of gave the Saudis a pass because maybe they're not as sophisticated as we are or supposed to be militarily. But that was a wake-up call. that we have got to start paying better attention. And John's talked about this on some previous webinars from the standpoint of a global, or not a global, but a regionally coordinated air defense capability. And we still need to do that. We have the technology to do all this. The problem is we haven't really put it to use. I mean, it's again, I'm being critical of our military partners, but we have got to get our act straight where there's no way an Iranian air attack in this day and age should be able to attack any of our forces any place in the region. We have got great capabilities from the standpoint of air defense systems. By the way, the Israelis are as good as they get at this. I mean, it's not like we don't know how to do it. So I think the military needs to be held accountable. I think John alluded to it a minute ago with the and maybe you did too, with the chairman and the Secretary of Defense. They're almost apologetic at times. They're not out leading the way as far as the discussion of what we ought to be doing. It's more, again, it's almost embarrassing. And I worry after the Afghanistan debacle of the departure we had there, and then some of the recent stuff here, that our military credibility is being hindered. John mentioned it, capability and will.
Mm-hmm.
And capability, part of that capability is, military leadership. And I think we're overly careful. When you become overly careful, you become ineffective. And I think we've really got to do now. What are we going to do about it on this webinar? Not a lot, but I think we need to face the fact that there's no doubt we have the strongest military capability in the world from the standpoint of technology and equipment and personnel to a certain extent. But we have got to get our act straight from a leadership standpoint, and I worry about it. So,
General, you thank you for that, and you raised a lot of key words in your response that got me thinking about another question I've got for you. You mentioned leadership, personnel, credibility, and we're talking about those in terms of our force posture, in terms of our standing in the eyes of Iranians. But I want to also address an issue that often I think gets overlooked because it can be intangible, which is the issue of morale. And what does it do for the morale of the American service member who's over in the Middle East or deployed anywhere on active duty? What does it mean to them? I mean, not just in an abstract sense that they wear the flag on their shoulder, but from a direct sense of their own safety on bases. Do you worry this is having a negative effect on morale of our forces if they see attacks on U.S. service members and the response, the long and short of the response is just not going to do a lot to prevent future attacks?
You bring up a pretty emotional point, and again, I caution myself. I'm not responsible for this right now. I'm not in the Middle East now. I'm not in the chain of command. I get all that, so it's easy to be critical without much consequence. But I'll tell you what, leadership in the military it isn't because you're a fun guy to be around or gal or whatever you want to call it. You're fun to be there. I like you. You let us have days off or whatever. It's about you're credible. I trust you that you're going to tell me to do the right thing to do, and you're going to be there when I need you there. And if I'm again, I don't know. Everybody's different, but I would suspect there's a little bit of concern right now about military leadership decision making. A little bit. You get 3 of our service members killed out there by some, third world country out there almost from the standpoint of how really good they are. And you got to say to yourself, what the heck am I doing out here? Am I being protected by, do my leaders know what I'm doing? Do my leaders know how to protect me? And one of the biggest problems we have, this is on a tangent a little bit, but one of the biggest problems we have in America right now is recruiting in the military. We can't make it. And if I'm a mom and dad right now with an 18-year-old out there, I'm going, maybe I'll send him to Israel and have him join the IDF. But I'm certainly not going to say, well, go ahead and do that so you can get a GI Bill. That's why most of the kids join the military nowadays, is because they want to have another life of some sort. And the parents are going to say, not in my watch. We have got, this is a big issue, the credibility issue brought up, I think. and we got to watch it.
Thank you for that response, General. Before I turn to John with a follow-on question, just a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, just type them in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to them in the little under half hour that remains. So John, General Wald, picked up on this issue of leadership, and that word with a capital L is something that comes up in a lot of JINSA's discussions about U.S. strategy for the region and the need for U.S. leadership. And so given that we've been talking about this balancing act the United States is trying to maintain in the region, where officially we want to restore some type of deterrence so we can avoid a major conflict that messes up what we're trying to do in the region, but at the same time, perhaps avoiding that same escalation is undermining our ability to lead. So I think it'd be helpful for our audience if you could situate sort of the topic here we're talking about, which is this U.S. attempt to restore deterrence against the Iranians, in terms of the larger goals that the administration and specifically is pursuing in the region, trying to de-escalate the Gaza conflict and then try to sort of continue with their regional agenda. Could you talk a little bit more about how you see what the administration is doing here in terms of, do you see them from their perspectives as it fit into what they're trying to do in the region more broadly? Or in terms of what the administration is trying to do, de-escalating the Gaza war, returning to their agenda of normalization and pursuing Israeli-Arab ties? Are those two things on completely divergent paths if the administration stays on its current course?
You've got to unpack it. Clearly, the administration now in Gaza is looking to, I think, try and bring this war to a close. They obviously want to help Israel get those poor hostages back, get them all back, and as many back as safely as possible and as soon as possible, which is a very, very noble endeavor. If it extends to actually trying to get Israel to stop fighting entirely so the United States can get about the business of running a presidential election campaign and de-escalating with Iran and figuring out how do we get to a normalization deal, I fear they're making a terrible, terrible mistake. For all kinds of reasons, Israel needs to get rid of that regime in Gaza. They need to take down Hamas, both to restore their own deterrence, to restore their faith with their own people, and to remove what we saw was a genocidal threat immediately on their border, get their own people to return to be able to live within the land of Israel along that border with Gaza. But more importantly, strategically, as I said, Gaza is just one theater in a much larger strategic struggle that's going on, whether we like it or not, between an Iranian-led axis backed by the Chinese and Russians and an American-led axis in which Israel is our most important, most powerful, most valuable ally. And we have a tremendous interest in seeing them, maybe for the first time in the history of the entire Iranian proxy network strategy, to see one of Iran's proxies taken down, destroyed, to see its regime removed, its military capabilities removed. Of course, the ideology will remain just as ISIS remains, but we did enormous damage to ISIS over the course of several years. Israel, after the worst massacre of its people since the Holocaust, has been at this not even 4 months yet, trying to take down, one of the most difficult military problems in existence. What we see with what Hamas has been able to establish there in 16 years, both above ground and underground, this enormous, vast tunnel network, some of it 10, 15 stories deep. It's just really quite extraordinary. I think an unprecedented challenge that any military has had to face in history, and an enemy who obviously believes they're winning when they kill as many Israelis as they can, and they believe they're winning when Israel kills as many Palestinians as it can, using these human shields. So it's absolutely an impossible situation. Israel needs the time and space. And I just think, get those hostages back, but do not do it at the price of forcing Israel to pull up short and to get some short-term relief from the international pressure we're facing. We're going to suffer long-term damage, just as we did in 2006 when we forced the Israelis to stop and allowed Hezbollah to emerge from the rubble, claiming victory together with Iran. We'll rue the day that we do that. And I think if we stop Israel, as much as our Arab partners and our Arab friends would like some relief from some genuine international pressure and pressure they're feeling from their own streets, who a lot of passions have been, they're getting 24/7 feeds on Instagram, on TikTok, on Al Jazeera about Palestinian children and women dying. So they've under real pressure. But even for them, if you talk to them in private, all of them are saying Iran and Hamas cannot be allowed to win here. If they do, I tell you, I think normalization becomes much, much harder, more difficult. You'll get a lot more hedging behavior. There will be an understanding that being a really close ally, and there's no closer ally than Israel they're looking at. Israel's the canary in the coal mine for them. If Israel's treated a certain way, then they are going to get the same kind of treatment. And if we force Israel to stop short here, short of a victory, to redeem those lives and the deterrence lost on 10/7, I think all of these Arab states will take a lesson that if that's the way the United States treats its best ally, Israel, my God, what do we have in store for us if we face this kind of threat? And we better start making adjustments now to our policies, whether through appeasement, concessions, hedging behavior, to look for other ways to take care of our security. So I think Gaza is critical, but it's critical not just in terms of Gaza, but in terms of this larger strategic struggle. It's hard not to give in to this short-term pressure, but I think it is absolutely essential, not just for Israel, but for the interests of the United States and the interests of a U.S.-led order with our moderate Arab allies and Israel in this part of the world.
So thank you, John. I have a follow-up question to you before we go back to General Wald. So based on what you just laid out there with the Israel dimension of this, I want to turn to another Israeli front that I don't think is getting as much attention, at least here in America, which is Israel's border with Lebanon, and U.S.-led efforts to try to de-escalate that situation as well. But I think sort of one question I have is, we're seeing sort of continued low-level back and forth strikes between Israel and Hezbollah along the border there. What's your assessment? Is Israel doing something there that we're clearly not doing with the other Iranian proxies around the region? Would you say that Israel has imposed costs on Hezbollah such that Hezbollah is clearly deterred from doing certain things, or is the fact that there is still an ongoing back and forth evidence that there's something perhaps lacking in the Israeli approach to Hezbollah as well? Because as you mentioned, if Gaza is but one front, I mean, Hezbollah is sort of the keystone of this Iranian proxy network. So is there something they're doing that we could draw from?
I'd say a couple of things. First, I do believe the Israelis are doing a disproportionate damage to Hezbollah. It's not talked about a lot, but I think there is a lot of Hezbollah infrastructure. A lot of fighters have been killed. Used to be the rules of the game were kind of one-to-one proportionality. Hezbollah would do something, Israel would strike back somewhere close to the border. They are now, they've pushed back a lot of Hezbollah effort back away from that border. There's a separate question of whether you can get a diplomatic deal that kind of lays that into stone and forces Hezbollah to abide by it over the long term. But I think Israel has imposed disproportionate costs on Hezbollah, both in terms of lives, in terms of several senior commanders killed in Hezbollah, and in terms of really degrading capabilities along that border of the Radwan forces. Now, I'd say that Israel is seeking to contain this. I mean, the fact is that they've got this burden. They're fighting another major war on their southern front, right? They're devoting, maybe only half of their forces up to the north paying attention there. They're engaged in a degrading operation in the north, but it's quite contained. It's a holding operations until they get much farther along in Gaza. We don't have that particular excuse on our side for why we're not engaged in a similarly disproportionate response against Iran. But I would say also at the same time, the Israelis are obviously doing disproportionate damage to Hezbollah capabilities across that border than Hezbollah is doing to Israel. Israel at the same time killed a slew of IRGC commanders in Syria over the course of the last less than 2 months, probably. Proof positive that you can take out major significant figures in the IRGC Quds force without it immediately escalating into an all-out regional conflict, just as President Trump with that strike on Soleimani proved that it does not necessarily have to lead to an all-out war, because the Iranians understand very well, and it's clear if you read anything in the Iranian press, that they are very, very fearful of a war with the United States, but they've simply reached the conclusion that they are right now immune from that kind of war because of their attribution of certain calculations to President Biden and his team, that their highest value is not protecting the lives of American servicemen. It is not ensuring that nobody is shooting at American servicemen. It's not protecting the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. Those are all important values to the president and the administration, but it's obvious by everything they say and do, their highest value is not to escalate in this conflict, not to take any move that could lead to escalation. And if you are the world's greatest superpower, engaged in this kind of struggle against this vicious an enemy, when they understand that that is your hierarchy of priorities, and at the very top is not escalating, not risking getting into a war, you have lost at least 90% of the battle. These guys are just going to continue pushing and doing and hitting you and damaging you to see how far they can get with their objectives, driving America out of those bases in Iraq and Syria, and forcing the United States to impose a ceasefire on Israel so Hamas, Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias can all claim a historic victory, that they perpetrated the worst massacre on the strongest military power in the Middle East in 75 years in the country's entire existence. And at the end of the day, they took their best shot, the IDF's best shot, and they're still standing to raise their flag in the victory sign. That is worth everything to them. They don't give a damn about the 20 or 25,000 poor Gazans that may have died. I should say, of course, that probably almost half of those are Hamas fighters, which nobody actually speaks about, and they should. Regardless, there's been enormous human suffering in Gaza, all of it because of what Hamas perpetrated on 10/7, and they don't care about any of it. Right now, it is a game for them to be able to raise that flag, control that rubble, and claim a victory for them and the entire axis of resistance.
You know, can I just,
please, yes.
I hate to even comment because that was so eloquent, but I mean, that was really well put. We got to keep that tape. But one of the things that occurred to me as this goes along is kind of, why doesn't Hezbollah respond more, or why haven't they? And my feeling is, we've talked about this in the past internally as well as on some of these webinars, but I think Hezbollah realizes that the Israelis after 2006 weren't going to let that happen again. They are ready to go. I mean, they're not going to hold back and worry about putting a rocket into some apartment that's firing missiles into Israel. And like John just said, the Israelis have done a really good job defending themselves up north. It isn't a tit for tat. It's we're going to smack you pretty hard if you give us a tit for tat here. I think Hezbollah knows that if they really go for it, it's the last time they're going to be in existence. Now it's tough because the Israelis have their hands full in the Gaza right now. They got, they're predisposed there, but they still have a good plan for going after Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hezbollah knows that. But I just wanted to add that part because we've talked about it a lot, that we're not going to have another occurrence like happened in 2006 where the Israelis got probably underprepared, maybe a little bit overconfident, maybe underled. Ain't going to happen again with Hezbollah. And that's deterrence. They're being deterred, frankly.
And I would
John,
add to
please.
that. Yeah, I would just add to it that the other people who know that what could happen to Hezbollah if Hezbollah goes too far is the Iranians and the Iranian supreme leader. And while Hamas is completely expendable to him, he's willing to die to the last Palestinians. He's willing to expend lots of Iraqi and Syrian militia fighters, Houthis, go at it. But Hezbollah is different. Hezbollah is the regime's insurance policy. Those 150,000 rockets, all of those precision-guided munitions that they've acquired over the years. That is if anybody tries to attack Iran, they're going to have to face Hezbollah. And as you've written about the potential for another northern war, Jonathan, as much damage as Israel is going to do to Lebanon and to Hezbollah, it's going to be a war of devastation and destruction, probably inside Israel in the home front, unlike anything they've experienced at least since 1948. So that's Iran's insurance policy. And it's got to ask itself, do I want to use that card now, or do I want to wait, hold that in abeyance, so I'm immune from an Israeli attack against my nuclear program? I can afford probably the Radwan forces. They're not my insurance policy. They're a terror tactic against the population in northern Israel. They're not an existential threat to Israel in the way those precision-guided munitions potentially could be. So I can afford maybe to make a temporary deal that moves the Radwan forces back a little bit from that border, as long as I preserve that strike capability that those missiles and drones and cruise missiles and PGMs give us. I don't want to expend those too early.
I think that's an incredibly important point, and so yeah, something that Jens has written a lot about, and I commend to everyone Jens's work on what we call the next Northern War, that raises a lot of the operational and strategic issues that John just raised. In the little time we have left, I want to be sure to answer some audience questions. We have one from Charles Wax, and General Wald, I'll start with you, and then John can of course chime in if you'd like. And I realize I'm asking this question to an Air Force general, but because it's largely been a Navy fight against the Houthis in Bab el-Mandeb and in Yemen. But could you address sort of how you see the U.S. campaign against the Houthis? Has it been effective, or are you noticing a lot of similar issues with how we've been waging that campaign? Because we talk about restoring deterrence against the Houthis, just like we talk about restoring it in these other theaters against Iran. So how would you rate what you've seen so far from the U.S. in terms of dealing with that separate threat down in Yemen?
Yeah, but I think it's been again, it's a tit for tat, and first of all, it's almost laughable how easy it would be to really go after the Houthis in a large way from the standpoint of sophisticated bombing. The problem the Saudis had with the Houthis is their intel was terrible. Matter of fact, they probably got their best intel from the Israelis, ironically. But their intelligence on what the Houthis' capabilities were was terrible. And number two, they wanted to fight a force-on-force trench warfare fight against the Houthis. This is crazy. I mean, the Saudis have really sophisticated aircraft and weapons and capability, and so I think from the standpoint of degrading the Houthis' capability, 85 attack bombs, whatever that number is, I don't even know what the total number is almost laughable. We ought to go in there and just destroy every bit of capability they have to threaten anything in the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden, wherever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer Charles's question, I think we're again. I think we're unsophisticated in our approach. I think the Houthis ought to realize, hey, you're in the wrong battle here, boys. This is not fighting the Saudis as far as a trench warfare fight. This is fighting the United States of America, and we're going to lose every bit of capability that the United States knows where it is. And we should bomb every possible military capability the Houthis have. We've got plenty of weapons, and I think we're being tepid again, frankly.
John, is there anything you want to add on that specific point?
No, I agree. I agree largely with Chuck. We may be degrading some capabilities, but my sense is the Houthis now can easily replace those capabilities. We are not inflicting the level of pain, and that when you just go force on force, the United States against this ragtag Shiite militia that controls half of northern Yemen through terror, but is living, in several centuries before us. There shouldn't be any Houthi assets or military leaders left standing. I would just say again, you got a couple Iranian ships out in the Red Sea. Iranians claim they have nothing to do with this. I'm sure we got intelligence up to our eyeballs and intercepts up to our eyeballs about what those ships are doing in terms of directing command and control and providing intelligence targeting about traffic in the Red Sea to the Houthis so they can take shots every single day at ships that we're supposed to be protecting. Why those ships of war that are enabling a war against people taking shots at American servicemen are allowed to continue sailing in the Red Sea is simply absolutely beyond me. Why there are Iranian and Hezbollah IRGC commanders operating inside of Yemen, helping to direct, to fund, to support, to help plan Houthi operations. Why those people are allowed to roam about freely, I have no idea. But I think in addition to what Chuck says you've got to do to the Houthis, you need to go after to those Iranian assets and personnel that are supporting the Houthis. Mm-hmm. You've got to make the Iranians feel very direct pain for their support and enabling and orchestration of this broad-based regional campaign that they are directing against the American-led order in the Middle East.
It's kind of it's almost laughable, but and I agree, John's exactly right. But the Savis, I guess it is, and Bishad are the two boats that have been sitting out there. They're both about the same size. They look about the same. They're obviously a command and control capability for they're the Houthis vis-a-vis the intel from the Iranians. They both, one went into port and one went into the Indian Ocean immediately after it became public that those two were sitting out there giving intel. We should have knocked them out, and we should do it today. They should be gone. We should tell the world this is what's happening. They're a command and control capability for stopping the shipping, the safe transit of ships through the Suez Canal area. They're causing international economic problems. They're going away. Very, very simple. To answer Charles' question, it doesn't take a Navy guy to figure that out.
So you both sort of anticipated my last question there, which is more positively going forward. What can we actually do? It's, as General Walsey said, it's easy enough to say what's being done wrong, but what can we offer as a realistic alternative? And I think in terms of the types of targets and U.S. actions, I think you both just covered that. But with the few minutes we have left, I guess my final question would be, given all the things that we've seen messaged poorly by the United States, the telegraphing of what we're going to do, the indicating, sort of unprompted that we don't want escalation, things like that, because deterrence is about credibility and messaging as much as anything else, are there suggestions or things that stand out to you that the way we can change our messaging in terms of deterrence, because we really have the capability if we want to use it. But how do we use our messaging to convince the Iranians we mean it? Is there a way to do that to complement the stronger posture you've recommended? So General Wall, I'll give you a minute, and John the last minute.
Yeah, mine will be short. John's the pro from Dover on this stuff, but I would say what occurs to me is that we're messaging the American public, not the Iranians, or our allied public, if you will, not necessarily Israelis, but others. And so we make these excuses about what we're gonna think about it. We're gonna have a very deliberate escalatory process. We're gonna see what happens. The Iranians are going, you guys are idiots. We ought to tell the Iranians the next time you ever step the line, you're going to get blown out of the water, period. And we're worried about public opinion, I think. We're worried about the election coming up. We're worried about, we're not doing real politics. The world isn't like we want it to be. We have to treat it like it is. And I don't think we are. But I defer to John on the policy side.
I agree with Chuck 100%. I had a lot of issues and concerns at times about the way the former president would talk, but I pine for the days of some of his statements and the degree of unpredictability and the degree of threat and fear that his statements injected into actors like the Iranians. You would never hear Trump say, the last thing we want is escalation in this part of the world. He would say, if you damage a hair on the head of an American troop, we are going to inflict pain on you like you have never, ever experienced before. It will be your worst nightmare. So stop now. I don't know exactly what the formulation is, but at this moment, if Biden's got an inner Trump, or if Secretary of Defense has an inner Trump in him, we need to start seeing more of that. Now, as Chuck warned from the beginning, at this point in time, we are so far down the hole in terms of the erosion of American deterrence that words alone are not going to do the trick. This is now primarily messaging can help, and messaging ought to be a complement to, but we are now left ourselves in a situation where this is a matter of really the application of hard power, and hard power in pretty overwhelming doses, where it is absolutely unmistakable to the Iranians that we are prepared to go as high as we need to go up this escalation ladder to get them to stop threatening American forces, American allies, American interests in the Middle East. We can do it. It will take more now than it would have taken a year ago. It'll take more now than it would have taken a couple of years ago if we'd been serious about sustaining American deterrence in the region rather than allowing it to erode as badly as it has. Now we got to try and restore it. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of internal fortitude and willingness to, and a lot of political risks for the president. But this is a situation we're in, and there are real American lives and the lives of American allies and American interests at risk. And I think we've just got to shift and pivot here if we're not going to find ourselves eventually with a whole lot more Americans dead in one of these incidents.
Thank you both. And to summarize and close, I'm reminded of a quote of someone, a former American diplomat who went through a lot of crises and said, often the riskiest course actually ends up being the safest. And so the best way to contain a crisis is to convince your adversary you're willing to predominate in it. We've gone a minute over, but I want to thank General Walden and John Hanna, as always, for their thoughts and their time. Thank you, as always, to our audience as well, and we look forward to seeing you again on another GINSA webinar. Take care and have a good week.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you both.
John. Great to see you both. Good work.
Great to see you.